need to get it off my chest. Since Jesus met me, I have followed him. I would die for him if I had to. But there's something that bothers me. I know the answer, and yet it's hard to accept. So what bothers me? It's something that has probably made questions come to you as well. It is this: if God is good, why do people suffer? In particular, I'm thinking about Christians. I understand more non-Christians. But why Christians? And why I bring this up is because a woman called Ruth. That's not her real name. I knew her when she was in Mansfield, when I was there. Ruth, before I came, moved into the Mansfield area. She moved there because her husband, who was a butcher, had to leave his job because of mental illness. And they had 2 children, 2 boys. When I got there, the church said we'd like to get them more involved, so I asked them if she would take part in the Christmas Eve service, and she sort of wondered whether she should, and then she said she would. But unfortunately, on Christmas Eve, on the airport road, when her sons were crossing the road, they were hit by a car. 1 was killed, 1 received brain injury. This threw them into great despair. They lost their children for a while to the Children's Aid Society. When they got their children back and everything seemed to be going well, then their house burned down. And they were getting settled, and Ruth had a huge faith for Jesus. And so they moved to Wyerton to see if they could start a new life. And it went well for a time. And then her husband became vicious with her, and she had to leave him and divorce him. And things were looking up. And you thought things were going to go well for her for the rest of her life. She met this Christian man, and he was really good to her. And a week before they got married, he had a massive heart attack and died. And you ask yourself the question, why? Where is God in all this? After all, does he not say in Romans 8:28, for all things work out for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose? And every time I think I have problems, I think of Ruth. And that's why I mention that is simply because of our passage. Because in Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 56, we have the compassion of God shown to us. It is shown actually to 3 people. It's shown to Jairus. It's shown to a woman with issue of blood. And also to a little girl who's 12 years old. So let's look at the lessons that we can learn. With the first one being 2 people, 2 needs. So there's Jairus. He was upper status in society. He was synagogue ruler. He was most likely a Pharisee. He was the one who organized all the worship services, and people would come to him when they needed help, and he would be a great support to them. But unfortunately, Jairus ran into trouble himself. His 12-year-old daughter got sick, and she was dying, and he didn't know what else to do. So he went to Jesus, and he fell on his knees, and he begged Jesus to come to help his daughter, to heal his daughter. And remember who he was. Upper echelon of society. He was a Pharisee, and many of them hated Jesus. But Jairus was at his wit's end, and he begged Jesus to come. He was in great need, but there was also a woman in need. She was on the other side of social status. Jairus was up here. He was considered clean, pure. People associated with him, but not with this woman, because she had an issue of blood. She had bleeding all the time, which made her ceremonial unclean. So no one could touch her. And if they touched her, then they would be unclean. She couldn't go into the synagogue. She couldn't go into the temple. She was sort of in a wasteland when it came to God. They were in need. Didn't matter who they were. It doesn't matter who we are. We have needs. Telephone can ring and all of a sudden your life is turned upside down. You can be driving along the road or someone you love, and there's an accident. Something happens and your bank account's cleaned out. You make what you think is a good deal and it doesn't turn out that way. You find the tests that come back are not negative, but they're positive, and you're sick. You don't know what to do about it. It hits everyone, whether they're educated or not educated, whether they're white or black or yellow. It doesn't matter how much money we've got in the bank, whether we're well liked by people or not well liked by people, whether we're healthy or unhealthy. We all have needs. That's what our passage is saying. And then there's the touch. This woman was unclean. For 12 years, she didn't have much to do with anyone before they didn't have anything to do with her. The only people that would touch her or have anything to do with her were the ones who weren't the Jewish people, for they considered her unclean. So she couldn't be touched. And maybe some of you are like that today, where you really want to be touched. Have that warmth of a person and a hug, that love, and that feeling of being included. And this woman didn't have this. And she desired it. And she didn't know what to do, for she had spent all her money with doctors. They couldn't heal her. And the only thing that she could do and think of to do was she heard of this person called Jesus. Maybe she heard of someone who was also healed by him. And she came to him hoping to touch him, hoping that he would touch her. And when she got close to him, she couldn't get close to him, for there was a crowd that was just pressing in on him. And the disciples were trying to part away for him. And she finally got close. She said to herself, if I only could touch his cloak, the edge of it. And she managed to do that. And instantly she was healed. The bleeding dried up. And she was feeling radiant inside and peaceful and joyful. But she didn't want anybody to know. And Jesus stopped right in his tracks and said, who touched me? And everybody denied it, even this woman. And finally the disciples said, how can you say someone touched you? See all the people? Of course lots of people touched you. And Jesus said, not the way this woman touched. This person touched me, for power came out of me. And this woman, people were looking around. They must have seen the shine on her face and the joy. And she finally had to come to Jesus and say, I was the one who touched you. I was the one who was healed. Instead of condemning her because she was unclean and she touched him, Jesus said, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Children of God, Think of what Jesus said. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Or if God said to one of you men the same thing, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? In fact, that's what he says to you and to I. He says to us when he calls us by name, calls us to himself, and we come to him so willingly. We come because we know that there's someone who loves us, who cares about us, who really wants us to be part of what he's doing and who he is. Remember what this woman was called. Not an outcast, not ostracized from society or the church. She was called a daughter, a child of God. And if you're called a child of God, you have peace, you have joy, you have God's favor resting upon you, and you are blessed. But then there's a part where there's faith, not fear. And we've forgotten somebody, haven't we? Jairus. Remember, he pleaded with Jesus to have Jesus come into his house to heal his child. And Jesus was on the way. And all of a sudden someone touched him. Jesus stopped in his tracks and said, "Who touched me?" And he wouldn't move. And what was Jairus thinking? He was thinking, "Hurry up, Jesus. My child is dying. Come on, Jesus, move it. What are you doing? Don't you care about me? Are you going to leave me in the lurch? If you don't hurry up, my child's going to die." And then a knife went into his heart because someone came and said, "Don't bother the master anymore. Your daughter has died." He would have been crushed. He would have been stunned. And he would have gone to Jesus and said, "There's no use coming anymore, Master." And he would have been thinking to himself, "Why didn't you hurry?" Don't we do that at times with God? We utter a word of prayer and we ask God to do something for us. Something that we really need. Maybe it's to relieve some suffering, the suffering of someone else. And God doesn't seem to answer. God's not in a hurry, but we're in a hurry. And we're caught between a rock and a hard place. We want to condemn God, yet we love God. And we don't understand what God's doing. And you know what Jesus said to this man, Jairus? He said, "Don't be afraid. Just believe and your daughter will be healed." Don't be afraid. My daughter's already dead. What do you mean, don't be afraid? What do you mean, only believe? What am I supposed to believe? Don't we say that as well? And what do we base our belief on? Is it some song or some word? No, it's Christ's word. Christ's faithfulness. Christ's love. Christ's compassion. And he's saying to each one of us, don't be afraid, only believe. You'll be healed. And then there's the awakening. Jairus followed Jesus. What else could he do? He had to go home anyway. And he would have been a basket case because there would be two things going through his mind. The one would be simply, don't bother the master any longer. Your daughter has died. And then there would have been Jesus' words, don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed. And so he was caught. And we've been caught, haven't we? We've seen what's around us. We know what God says. And we find it so hard to believe, and yet, even though Jairus found it hard to believe, there was that hint of belief, that seed of belief in him. He had just seen someone healed of 12 years of an issue of bleeding. And so there was hope. And when Jesus got to the house, he said to the crowd, you don't go in. And he only took Jairus and his wife and 3 disciples. Why did he take the 3 disciples? To witness what was going to happen. And did it happen? When he went into that house, the funeral had already started because they buried him within 24 hours. And that house would be filled with professional mourners and other mourners. And they would have these shrill voices, the wailing and the sobbing. And they would have the flutes with their low and pitched, dull, mournful sound. And you would have the other neighbors and family gathering together. And they would be consoling those there and trying to console Jairus. And what did Jesus do? He said, stop wailing. You don't do that. But he did. And they said, why not? And he said, she's not dead, she's asleep. And they said, we know a dead person when we see a dead person. She's dead, and nobody comes alive. And so he took Jairus, the 3 disciples, into the room, shut the door. He touched this little girl that's 12 years old, and he said, get up. She opened her eyes. She started to breathing, and she immediately stood up. And could you think of what Jairus and his wife must have done? They would have been stunned. The disciples would have been stunned because dead people don't rise from the dead. And then they would have realized what had happened, and there would have been quite a reunion. And Jesus said a very practical thing, for he's very practical. He said, give her something to eat. And when we think of that, we need to think that something else. Jesus does raise people from the dead, and we're going to be one of them. The Bible tells us that when we die, our bodies go to the ground, where it came from, and our spirits go to God, who gave it to us. Our spirits, we will live in paradise with God until the last day, when the trumpet call will sound and the archangel will cry out and Christ will come back. And those who have died and have come back with Christ, their bodies will be raised from the dead, and they will be united to their spirits, and we will have our full salvation. Seem hard to understand? Hard to believe? Well, it's going to happen. That's the promise of God, and he is faithful and he is true. And then we're going to see things a little differently. We're going to see all those struggles that we've had in the past. And we're going to see how God has knit them all together for our good and for his glory. And then the words of Revelations chapter 21 will be true. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming out from God as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a voice from the throne saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will be with them. They will be his people, and God will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there shall be no more mourning or crying or death or pain, for the old order of things has passed away."